My name is Laird Klingler. I'm a librarian with the Cornish Historical Society. The date is May 25th, 2017. We're at the home of George and Jill Edson for an interview. They live at the corner of 120 and Claremont Road, and Billy Scharf will be doing the interviewing. May we start, please, and thank you for inviting us into your home. Where and when were you born, George?
I was born April 9th of 1944 in Montpelier, Vermont.
Jill?
And I was born July 26, 1944 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Well, that's a great lead-in. I can't imagine many people in Cornish being born in Mississippi. Tell us about, well, first of all, why Mississippi? Tell us about your childhood and, growing up, and then how you finally arrived in the northern New England.
I was born during the war, and my father was stationed at Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And my mother and father met there, and when he came back from being overseas, he was in the medical corps. He went to Rutgers, and then he went to Colorado State University. So he had not gone to college before he went into the war. And by then he had 2 children. So we lived in New Jersey and we lived in Colorado, and then he was a native of Nebraska, so we lived there for a while. My mother was a native of Burlington, Vermont. So we moved back to New England when I was about 12. My father became a veterinarian. Before that, he had sheared sheep. That was what he did for a living. And my mother said, "I'll marry you, but not if you're going to ride your horse from ranch to ranch and shear sheep." So she was, her parents had died and left a small inheritance, and so they were able to send him through school. And sister I'm very close to, and then another sister came 7 years later, so there's 3 of us, and we moved to Montpelier in about 1958. And George and his family were there already.
I met your father, a very nice man. I remember that he liked dahlias.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I do. I had
Yes.
to meet him.
Yes.
George, tell us about your childhood.
Oh, mine was a little simpler than Jill's. Born and brought up in Montpelier, Vermont. Lived in the same house from the day I was born till the day I left for after college. In the city in Montpelier, and I call it a city. Montpelier is not a very big city, but my grandmother lived at 37 Liberty. We lived at 47 Liberty, and neighborhood and all the things that you do in a city. I remember a couple things from my childhood. One was wanting to earn money from an early age, and I used to take my little red wagon and go up and down the street and get newspapers. And we could sell them then for 2 cents a pound or something. So I would fill the garage with newspapers. My father would have to borrow a truck periodically to take them down and get me my 27 cents or whatever. I also built from an early age. We'd build what I called shacks. We'd scrounge some wood, we'd build a shack, and then we'd tear it down and build a bigger shack, scrounge some more wood. So I've been building since I was probably 10 years old.
Now, did you met in high school?
We did. I moved to Montpelier when I was in the 6th grade, and George and I are the same age, so he was also in the 6th grade. But we became high school sweethearts when we were seniors. Before that, we had no interest in one another.
Do you remember when George asked you out for the first time?
I do. There were water fountains in the hall, and there were lockers in the hallway of the school. And my locker happened to be quite close to a water fountain. And it seemed like we would meet at the water fountain.
Oh.
And in those days, there were a lot of dances, high school dances. Every Friday night there was a football dance in the fall. And I remember that he asked me if I'd like to go to a football dance.
What happened was that Jill had a boyfriend during our junior year, and we flirted a lot at our locker. She mentions the water fountain, but I remember the locker. I think your locker was right next to mine. And we flirted in classes, and we flirted at our locker, but she had a boyfriend. But he went to Norwich University in September, and they couldn't get out till like Christmas. So the first week that he was gone, I asked her out, and that was.
Then it went from there.
It went from there, yes.
Now, after high school, Jill, you went to college in Vermont. George, you went to college in Massachusetts. You were married in 1967, and you located then in Claremont. Why Claremont? How did you happen to arrive in Claremont?
My grandfather, bought a bakery in Montpelier in 1908. My father went into business in the 30s, and I went into business the minute I got out of school in 65. And literally almost a week I graduated from college, my father bought a bakery in Claremont called Goddard's Bakery. It'd be very few people around here that would remember that name, but Goddard's was a good-sized bakery in Claremont. So I literally graduated from college on a Friday and moved to Claremont on Monday. So I always say I lived in Montpelier until literally about the day I graduated from college. So that's what brought us to Claremont.
We always like to ask people who know Claremont from the past, give us your thoughts, Claremont past and present. Jill, why don't you start? Claremont has changed, of course, a great deal.
Well, when we got married, the interstate was just being built. And Claremont was a very active center of commerce. The stores were open on Friday nights until late. There was a lot of shopping in Claremont. People from Springfield, people from Windsor, people from Newport would come to Claremont. There was a supermarket right on the main, on Pleasant Street in downtown Claremont. People worked at a plant, a Sylvania plant in, I think, Hillsborough. And the bus would come and pick up large groups of people and take them to work and then drop them off there afterwards, so that IGA was open 24 hours a day because of the workforce. And Joy Manufacturing had they were the largest employer in Claremont. And they made, if I think I'm correct, primarily compressors. And those compressors were used to build the interstate highways. And once all of this interstate highway construction was done, there was not the demand for their product. And at the same time, the interstate highway bypassed Claremont, New Hampshire. So even though it had really been a place that attracted a lot of people, all of a sudden people were on Interstate 91 and going right up from Springfield to the Upper Valley. And the whole picture of industry in the Lower Valley area was almost all machining. And all of that industry took a hit. So the commerce in Claremont, in Springfield, in Windsor changed drastically when the demand for the product was not what it had been. Now there's more precision manufacturing, but at that time it was foundries and large machinery.
George, add some of your observations from Claremont, past and present.
Well, when I came to Claremont in '65, they were literally building the interstate over in Ascutney. It was all, I'd drive down from Montpelier and crisscross the new roads and the old roads. The major thing that changed Claremont was, as Jill said, the interstate. Claremont was the hub. Now Lebanon is the hub because of the intersection of the two interstates. And Claremont, as she said, just building on what she said, was thriving. Friday nights, people would come down and get an early parking place, older people, sit in their car just to watch people. There'd be policemen at every intersection directing traffic. The sidewalks were packed. It was a prosperous community, a lot of blue-collar workers, but they worked hard, they made good money, they kept their houses up, and it's changed a lot. And I understand, and I forget where I've heard it and what the reasoning was, that some people in Claremont didn't want the interstate going by. Maybe they thought it would change it too much. Well, it kind of did the opposite. It went somewhere else and changed it a lot.
Steve Taylor in our interview talked about that the politicians, the Lebanon politicians, were the ones responsible for getting the highway to go in the Lebanon direction. What are there, like 4 exits up there now? And Claremont didn't have the clout, perhaps, that Lebanon did.
Or maybe the vision. They might not have even had the vision.
I think they didn't see it the same way.
Yeah.
Representative James Cleveland lived in New London. New London has 3 exits. I mean, there you go.
Norris Cotton was from
Absolutely, and they got 5 exits, or 6 maybe, between New London and the Connecticut River.
Now, your time in Claremont, we're talking about before the big box stores out on Washington Street.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh yes, there was none of that was developed.
Now, then you located here to Cornish. So let's ask why Cornish and why this house?
We love this part of the story because we'd been married about a year and a half, and decided that we wanted to find a home. We lived in an apartment, and George kind of wanted to raise some cattle and have a little bit of land, and so we had this vision that maybe we'd try to find a house with about 10 acres that we could afford. And we looked in North Newport and West Claremont and maybe even North Charlestown. We just, we didn't really identify a town. And one day we'd gone to a high school football game in Lebanon, and on the way back, we came down Route 120. And this house was sitting here with grass up to the windows and a little real estate for sale sign stuck in this tall grass. It just a very forlorn home. Didn't look loved. And we sort of looked at it and thought, maybe that's affordable. That was on a Saturday afternoon. I think we saw the house on Sunday, and we closed on it not until March. But we were able to buy the house. It had 75 acres. It didn't have a dependable water supply. It didn't have a central heat. It didn't have any insulation. Nothing had been done to it in decades, but it fit the bill. And so we just happened to end up in Cornish. We weren't necessarily looking for Cornish.
Well, George, I know from talking to you that you did a tremendous amount of restoration work, on the house. Tell us, how old is the home? I mean, about the history of the home?
We don't really know. I'd like to know exactly when it was built, but we're saying about 1870s because of the configuration of a lack of fireplaces, and I guess that's a period where there were more stoves and smaller fireplaces. Stoves would feed into the fireplaces. So that part of the house, which we're not really seeing too much here, but the old part, which is the large cape, was the original. And what we're sitting in is the L, and I built this in 1986. But back to restoration, we bought the house in March. We redid, we put in a kitchen, because it really almost, you could say, didn't even have a kitchen, and did a lot of restoration before we moved in July. So it's just been a constant
After work
working on
every
it
day.
we've been here 48 years.
Yeah.
So,
Was it a farm?
It was eventually.
well,
initially.
sure. I think almost everything was. There was a barn. There was a place out to the side where people told us there used to be a barn.
Mm-hmm.
But I came from, as I say, a city, living in a neighborhood with houses on all 4 sides. And how I had an interest in animals, I have no idea. I would sit in a chair in my college dorm, dreaming about someday having cattle. And now Jill's father was a veterinarian. I did go on calls with him, and maybe that's where it came from. But so when we came here, first year we got 2 pigs, in the second year 3 pigs, in the third year 2 pigs, and then I started getting some cattle. We had cows for 29 years here.
Hmm. Now, while you were living here, you were raising your family. You had 3 children.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting a little ahead of ourselves chronologically, but could you tell us about your children, about the 3 children?
We have 3 daughters, and they were born in 72, 74, and 76. And they were all born in Claremont and went to the Cornish school. And some of the teachers that they had are still in the Cornish school, which is wonderful. They all went to Stevens High School, and they all then went on to post-secondary. And one of them lives in Plainfield, New Hampshire now. Our daughter Elizabeth moved back to this area about 10 or 12 years ago. And currently one in San Antonio and one in Key West, Florida.
Well, I know your daughters by 3 associations: West Point, Dunkin' Donuts, and the airline industry.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So the youngest one graduated from Boston College, majoring in finance, and said when she finished, I really don't want to sit in front of a computer terminal, and I don't want to sit in an office. I really would like to be a flight attendant. So within a month or so of when she graduated from Boston College, she got a job with United, and she's been with them for about 18 years. Loves her work because she loves the flexibility. Loves to travel. She's been to China many, many times and many other places all over the earth. Once she went to Dubai because she had a long weekend. So it's that kind of flexibility. Elizabeth graduated from Babson College and eventually landed at the corporate level of Dunkin' Donuts. And she's a director of operations for many of the franchises in northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Montreal. And Emily, who was the middle kid, had a lot of options to go to colleges. She was accepted at Wharton. And we came home from work one day and she said, I've decided that I'm going to go to West Point. And it just kind of blew us away. My father had been active in the military during the war, but just during the war. But she just decided that she was going to go to West Point and was nominated, was accepted, did exceptionally well, majored in Russian and systems engineering, was at the top of her class in systems engineering. And, I think we have to thank Emily because paying for 3 children to be in college at the same time was overwhelming. But by going to West Point, and she was the child in the middle, we never had all 3 in school at the same time. Yeah.
George, anything you'd like to add there? You've told me that you were quite surprised about Emily's decision to go to West Point.
Yes. I'm speechless only because I would say something and my wife told me I couldn't say it, but I will say it anyway. She was a little wild in high school. And so the fact that she felt she needed the regimentation, she felt that she welcomed the fact. She literally said if she'd gone to a school where there was people running up and down the hallways, and she just felt that might have led her, I shouldn't say led her astray, but anyway. And so, of course, West Point would be the exact opposite. You could not be more regimented. And she thrived there. She did very well.
And she's also the smallest, isn't she?
Yeah.
She's what, 5?
Maybe 5'4". Very small.
And small. And there were physical constraints or restraint or whatever. Difficulties. She had to do certain obstacle things. She had to climb over this and that. And some of them she basically had a very difficult time doing, and barely could pass all the muster, but she did. She had to jump out of an airplane how many times?
I think maybe only 3 times.
But after the second time, she said, well, I have my wings. And we said, what do you mean? I thought it was 3 times. She said, yeah, but even if I die the 3rd time, they give you your wings. So, she... Well,
good for her.
So one of the other things that they had to do is everybody had to jump off. I think it was a 30-meter diving board, fully dressed with a full pack and a weapon with their shoes and everything into a pool and be able to get to safety. And Emily is a very small person and had this enormous pack, the same pack that somebody George's size would be wearing. But I remember when she told us that she had to do that, I thought, but she did well. She didn't love it. She didn't love it. In fact, when we went to her graduation, she said, "You'll notice that nobody's crying."
Yeah.
She said at other colleges people cry because they're graduating. Here they just say, "We made it. We're out of here."
Good. Well,
So
now, with the children growing up and you being so close to Cornish Flat, when you moved here, tell us about Cornish Flat, when you moved here.
I would say that except for activity at the store, Cornish Flat hasn't changed much. There's been very few new houses, and most of the homes that have been built are not on the main roads. So Cornish Flat, I don't think, has changed much. We had the library, we had a post office in the store, and then it was at Ruby Magoon's house, wasn't it? It was at a little house on Stage Road. But if you look at the homes in the flat, they're all there. Bernice Johnson lived in one, and her brother lived a few houses down on the corner. And so some of the occupants have changed, but I personally don't think Cornish Flat has changed much. The fire station was built since we moved here. No, it wasn't. It's just been rebuilt, hasn't it?
It was rebuilt.
Yeah.
Torn down and rebuilt.
Yeah.
We can get into your volunteer activities with the meeting house later, but at that time, was the church still in operation?
We weren't aware of it. Were you aware of the church being used?
I would say when we moved to town that the church was not being used, that the local church owned the two buildings, but I think they pretty well used the
Center Road.
on Center Road, and I don't think that was used at all, as I remember.
Well, George, you add your observations about Cornish Flat.
Well, Cornish Flat, I'd agree with everything Jill said. In fact, Cornish itself, you could say, hasn't changed much compared to communities in southern New Hampshire that have doubled, tripled, quadrupled in size and grown dramatically. The Cornish population and numbers of houses in 50 years has not changed that much. There's two developments, you might say, the group of houses off from North Parsonage and
East Road?
Beechwood
Acres?
Beechwood Acres, and an occasional house here and there, but the people have changed, of course, more than the houses, and the people have changed. We've been here 48 years. There can't be more than 3 or 4% of the people here that were here when we came. Some locals that were born and brought up here, but not too many.
I'd like to move now to your careers. Jill, tell us about your career. I'm particularly interested in the last 2 times that I had my furnace service. There were graduates from the vocational program, and I was very impressed with that a young person graduating with the skills immediately could get a good job. I know you were involved with the vocational education. Yeah. Could you talk about that, please?
I was certified as a teacher, and when we got married, I worked in Vermont for a year, and then when we got married, I worked at Fall Mountain and in the Claremont school system. And when the children were born, I worked for the State Department of Education as a home economics consultant for about 10 years, and that was part-time work. And then when the children were back in old enough, I applied for and received a job in the Claremont system as director of adult education. And that was a very fulfilling job. We ran an adult high school, we ran the GED program, adult basic ed, an adult tutorial program, and a lot of enrichment programs. And while I was doing that job, the position as Director of Vocational Education became available. And I was certifiable to be able to take that over. And it was in the Sugar River Valley Regional Technical Center. And we had 7 programs: machining, plumbing and heating, building construction, computer repair and technology, culinary arts, early childhood education, and business systems. And they were all very strong. It was a new building and well equipped. We received students from from Sunapee and Kearsarge, Newport, and Claremont. So the children all converged to take a double period of class. And the focus of each of those programs was career preparation. You don't become prepared to be a plumber to service Laird Klingler's heating plant because of 2 years at the high school level. But if you do that and you complete that program, you acquire a certain number of skills that helps you then as you go forward. The person who services our heating system was here just last week, and he's been in the business now for 16 years, and is a very valuable employee.
Former student.
It was funny. He was in the basement. And he said, "Mrs. Edson," and I, after all these years, he's calling me Mrs. Edson. But that was it. The fact is that education can't be a cookie cutter, and not everybody is going to want to take strictly academics. And our programs were so strong that we had a number of the top 10 students at Stevens High School enrolled in our machining program and some of our other programs. They were going to pre-engineering and so enrolled because they had that as a elective option, enrolled in machine tool technology so they could apply their logarithms and other math skills that, as kids sit in the academic side of the house, they say, "Why are we learning this?" Well, this was why we're learning it.
Good.
So
Good.
it was wonderful. And I retired early because my father, who you've mentioned, my mother had died, and it was my turn to help take care of my father. But it was a great job. I'd still be there if I wasn't.
George, tell us about your career.
One detail about Jill's that she forgot. She worked a year at St. Mary's High School, and I think she was the only
Lay teacher.
She was in her early 20s, and she was this young, a good-looking blonde teacher, as opposed to the more traditional Catholic teachers, and that was an interesting experience and a wonderful experience. Only a half a year?
Half
Or
a
a
year.
year and a half.
I had
They
taught.
called her in.
Yeah, I had taught biology in Vermont, but I wasn't certified. This was before the days of being highly qualified. And I had taught biology to college-bound students in Vergennes, Vermont. And then St. Mary's had an employee who had a master's in biology, but the children were not responding. And Father Carty called me and he said, "We need you to come and teach general science and biology." And I said, "Well, number one, I've never taught general science. I probably never even took it. And number two, I'm not a biology teacher." And he said, "Yeah, but you're a teacher." And that's what's important. And he said, we have these children who don't know what they're going to need to know when they're in high school, and they need biology to go on to college. So I came in January, and they hired me for 2 periods a day. They gave me lunch. they paid me $56 a week, which was a huge amount of money. And I put the very first day I put the word biology on the blackboard, just put the word biology. And there was only a few children in the classroom that had any idea what biology was. So they had been 3.5 or 4 months enrolled in this high school level biology, and they hadn't paid any attention, and they didn't know what they were even studying. So it was actually easy because I crammed an entire year into a half a year, and they were so anxious to learn that it worked.
But I do want George to continue with his career now.
Well, I got out of school, came to Claremont to the family business, and that was 65. In 77, after 12 years, my grandfather had been in some degree of financial difficulty when he reached the end of his career. My father was reaching the end of his career. We always seemed to be in financial difficulty. I said, I'm not going to be the third generation. So after 12 years, I left. I gave like a 2-year notice, and it was all went well. And I went into real estate, and I spent a couple of years selling a broad variety of real estate before buying one of my listings, which was DeMonte's store, and that was in 81. And there'd be a lot of people that would remember DeMonte's store. It was out in West Claremont. Very, very, very neat store. Convenience store, but a full meat department, and just a wonderful store. I operated that for 6 years. While I was there, I started a company called Millbrook Realty, which dealt in the sale of grocery stores, because I'd been allied to the food business at the bakery. I'd been owning retail store at my store, so I started selling grocery stores all over New Hampshire and Vermont. I sold about 120 of them over the course of 17 years. And at the end of that, I bought another one of my listings. I had a store listed in North Walpole called Discount Food Warehouse, and it sold, for want of a better word, dented cans and things like that. And I was there for 13 years and retired in 2011.
Okay. Now, I'd like to move now to your volunteer activities. And Jill, I believe you were on the school board for 12 years, is that correct?
19.
19, excuse me. Now, I'd like to ask you about your time on the board, but let's reserve the question of declining enrollment to later in
Sure.
the conversation. But so 19 years on the school board. Well, tell us about your activities there.
Well, the thing that's interesting is that I had read in the paper that Alvin Barris, who was the local minister, was not going to run for re-election, and that nobody had filed for election. And I thought, wow, the amount of tax dollars that we pay for the school, I can't believe that nobody is interested. So I went and filed. Well, I wasn't smart enough to know that people don't file until the end. And so at the time there was a 3-person board, and it was a 5-person race. It ended up being a 5-person race. And Bernice Johnson, who was the town clerk at the time, had said, Jill, nobody knows you. And I said, yeah, you're right, because we'd only lived in this town a few years. So I had some brochures printed up, which was really very unusual for Cornish, New Hampshire, I think. And I went door to door over many, many, many roads in January and February of that year, just handing out this brochure, telling them what my qualifications were, and asking them to vote for me. And so there were 3 of us on the board, Willow Densmore, Michael Yatsevich, and myself. And Michael and Willow had been on the board for a long time. 3-person board. The school had a teaching principal. So the principal had classroom duties except for maybe 1 period a day when he was supposed to be the principal. And it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. And then after maybe 4 or 5 years, they voted in a 5-person board, which made a lot more sense. And I don't know why I stayed on the board for 19 years, but there was so much work to be done that when it was time to file again, you just sort of said, if I leave now and someone comes in and undoes all of this, so I stayed on that board until I got the job in Claremont, New Hampshire.
Continuing on the education theme, George, at the center, I recently cataloged an obituary for Norman Shabbat, and that sort of leads me into to you. I mentioned about his generosity with the school, so let me allow you to take over from that point on.
Well, let me try to be efficient with the story. I don't know what year, about 85 or so, Norm Chabot stood up at the school meeting and he said, I'd like to make a donation of $50,000 over 10 years towards the building of an addition to our school that would include a gymnasium with a stage. And so then there was a intermission, and I heard buzzing around. People would say, oh, I'd give $100 for that, or I'd do this or that. And I was thinking, we're not going to do it at $100 here and there. So make a long story short, I headed up a campaign to raise
$350,000.
which was the bond cost of the thing. So the theory was the bond interest cost, if the townspeople paid through taxes for the principal, it would make it much more palatable if we could raise privately the bond interest cost. So in the course of basically a summer, and I just have to immodestly say, pretty much alone on purpose, I like to work alone, I would drive around in my pickup truck with a model of the school with the addition on it, and I would look for people out in their garden or mowing their lawn, and I would wheel over and stop, and I'd get out and I'd put the thing on the tailgate, and I would solicit pledges, and it was a 5-year program. And one of my friends tells me, he said, I never was going to give X amount, but until George Edson told me I was. So I do have a knack for raising money, and we did raise the $350,000. It completely covered all of the bond interest, and we had money left over at the end of the bond, and it bought a number of other things over the course of a couple of years.
It's very admirable, yes.
We billed people.
Jill did the work for 5 years.
Yeah.
Jill billed twice a year. And that was part of the thing. If you had a pledge due of such and such, it was more palatable if it could be paid twice a year. Jill did all the billing, all the follow-up, and those checks were sent to our house. Now today,
right.
would
all
anybody...
the records were at our house. We would photocopy the checks and send them to the school district to deposit. We had all of the documentation.
You were a bank.
Well,
absolutely.
It was very, very, but it worked. And I can't remember how many pledges we got, but we only had something like 2 or 3% default. Virtually everybody made good on their pledge.
And $350,000 in the town of Cornish.
That many
I
years
hardly
ago.
know of anybody outside of the town that pledged, and that's just a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And that was 30 years ago.
And some of those pledges were like $500 for 5 years.
Or $100.
$100 a year. We did have a few. We even had one $10 pledge, but we took it. It was.
No, that's very impressive.
Yeah.
I'd like to, Jill, for you, another volunteer activity with the recycling center.
Yes.
Could you begin by, a lot of people don't know this, but begin by what used to be there and how was trash taken care of?
Well, when we moved here, it was a open burning dump. People would go to that site, which is now the Cornish Recycling Center, and throw their trash into a smoldering area. There would be rats. People would go up there and shoot rats. And then the state of New Hampshire said, you're not going to do any more open burning. And so all of the towns in the area had to find some alternatives. And so there were committees, and I happened to be on a committee in Cornish. Rev Whiteman, Nancy Whiteman, Bill Gallagher, a man named Louis Hawes, who no longer is with us. We all kind of got together and said, what can we do?
Isn't
And
Susan Van Rensselaer part of that too?
Susan was, well, yes, on that committee. And then there was maybe it was even a county-wide committee, and I was the Cornish representative to that, to talk about, let's talk about the big picture. And that's when Wheelabrator, when the whole idea of the incinerator came in. But we in Cornish wanted to make sure that the emphasis was on recycling. So even though there were some refuse that could not be recycled, we wanted to recycle. And that group, including Susan Van Rensselaer, worked very hard to convert the dump to a recycling center. And we had to separate our glass into different colors. We had to break things. We had to bundle newspapers. They wouldn't take magazines, but they'd take newspapers, but they had to be tied in bundles. The aluminum had to be separated from tin. And the timing, our daughter Elizabeth was in kindergarten when it opened. And I'll never forget, because it happened that the newspaper was there when we opened the recycling center, and there was a picture of Elizabeth throwing something into a 55-gallon drum, because that's the scope of what we were doing, is throwing tin cans into drums.
I don't think people realize that. Nancy Whiteman told me this. At the beginning, it was volunteers. It wasn't a town
All volunteer
function.
for many, many years.
We all know it today as being operated by the town.
Yeah.
But people like yourself,
Right.
I mean, were volunteer, did this on a volunteer basis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes there was a demand for the product, and other times there was no demand for the product. But that, that's been 40 years. I haven't looked at the date on the sign, but I would say that Elizabeth, our daughter Elizabeth, is 45, and she was 5 years old when it opened.
Okay, George, I'd like to move to your volunteer activity, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you were the head of the first zoning board in Cornish, and when it was first approved, is that correct? Now, I do know that the idea of zoning was not totally popular in town. There was opposition to it. Could you describe the beginnings of the zoning and your involvement in it?
Well, actually, there was a zoning board of adjustment, if that's what they called it, before zoning was passed. And I was a member with Clara Weld, Myrtle Ferry, and Orville Fitch. And they were all at least 20 or 30 years older than I was. And the selectmen would appoint us. We had no ordinance to enforce. What we really did is the selectmen would say, so-and-so's building a garage and we don't like where it is, or it's too close to the road or something, so we want you to meet and discuss it and maybe decide that he shouldn't be building it there. We would meet with no notice. We would meet not in public. We would go to somebody's house and sit around and talk about it and issue an edict or a ruling, all of which is just really crazy when you look back. And yes, zoning was passed. I should have looked it up before we started, 70s sometime. And it was voted down a time or two or three. And yes, there was a fair amount of dissension and disagreement. The argument being, it's my land, I should be able to do what I want with it. And which is still heard sometimes today. They did pass an ordinance, and I was elected the chairman of that first group. Bill Balch was on it. Caroline Storrs mentioned Bill Balch's name on her video, saying that Bill was currently a very valuable member and knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows all the history of zoning. He was on that very first zoning committee. And Nicholas Leeds, a name long gone, was on that committee. And we really had a difficult time figuring how to work this. So it was very interesting. And I got off because eventually I went into real estate, and I felt there was a conflict there. I couldn't really be practicing in real estate at the same time making decisions on real estate. So I got off.
See. You know, another volunteer activity, and I know this has taken a huge amount of your time, is with the fair. Now, you've been a director of the fair, and every year you're so involved. Tell us about your fair activities.
Well, I told Leland Atwood years ago, I said, I'd like to be on the fair board, but I was working. And I said, maybe someday when I retire. Well, darn it, Leland remembered. And one night I got a call and he said, George, you said, and I said, oh, okay. It's only been about 10 years, so I'm a newcomer. A lot of those fair directors have been on for 20 and 30 years and more. But yes, I am active. I enjoy it. I've been, again, involved in the fundraising and the sponsorship
Tell us about the stage.
program. Well, the stage, I designed the stage. I went through several incantations. I went to an engineer with one of my first designs, and he said, oh no, it'll blow away or collapse or whatever. So I kept working at different designs and finally came to the current one. And I knew I could raise the money for it, but you get sick of raising money. And it was going to be $20,000 or $30,000, and you go and ask somebody for $2,000, and they say yes, and you feel wonderful, and you leave, and oh look, I got $2,000, but you still got to get 23 more. So I just dragged my feet, and after a couple of years, I thought, what we really ought to do is to find a source where we can pretty much get it funded by one party. And so that's what I did. I finally determined who might be a logical donor, and they were, and so that's how we got the stage.
The name is on the stage.
That would be Whalen Engineering, yes.
Okay. Now,
And that was primarily the materials, right? And a lot of volunteer labor.
Oh, it's everything.
I went down there one day.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah.
I have heard people say that they would prefer that the fair be a purely agricultural fair. How do you react to that?
We are one of the most agricultural fairs in the state. The Rochester Fair just went out of business. The Rochester Fair is one of the biggest fairs in the state. And they went out of business. They had no agriculture. So whether that's a factor or not, I don't know. There's a lot of factors, I'm sure. But we have had, a number of years lately, the largest cattle show of any fair in New Hampshire.
Or
So
Vermont.
even though we're not one of the biggest fairs, Marcia Clark, I'll give her huge credit, she runs a great cattle show. And so my answer here is that we are very agricultural now. We have a huge chicken operation in the last few years that we didn't have before. So we're very agricultural. Steve Taylor speaks well of the fair because he says it's the only fair where the agriculture is in the middle of the fairgrounds. So many other fairgrounds, you walk in and you've got booths and you've got rides, and if you want to see the animals, you got to walk off to the edges of the fair, whereas our animals are right in the middle. So
I'd like to move now to some of the challenges that in Cornish, and I suppose one of the biggest changes in Cornish has to do with the decline in school enrollment. Let's start with you, Jill. Why do you think the enrollment has declined in Cornish?
Well, let me just tell you that when I got off the school board, our enrollment was 235 or 240 children in our K through 8 school. And it held at that level for maybe 3 or 4 years, and then it started declining. We had a gentleman who lived in our town named Alan Penfold, and he had done a lot of analysis of the data, birth data. And he was constantly at school district meetings talking about what our census was and how it would grow or how it would shrink. And in those days, every household in Cornish had to fill out a census form and send it to the selectmen so that they would know that this house, in our case right now, 2 73-year-old people live in this house. But if we had a 5-year-old or a 18-month-old, that would all be part of the record. I think the main reason the census has gone down is because there's people who live in homes that could accommodate large families. A lot of people that we know that don't want to leave Cornish. So they stay here and they live in these homes, like George and I live in this home. And so therefore it's not available for somebody to move into with their children. And I think it's been more, I really think it's more of a housing issue than it is almost anything else. I think Cornish, because it hasn't grown that much, there aren't that many options for people to move in and find affordable housing, that the census has just dwindled because our children have grown up and left, and the Stores' children have grown up and left, and the Whiteman's children have gone up and left, and I think that's the major factor.
George?
Declining enrollments are a factor all over the state, all over Vermont. It's a huge issue in Vermont right now. And because we're doing this for historical purposes, let me make a few comments that will be of interest when people look at this down the road. There are those who say that these declining enrollments will turn around. There's a lot of people that are just really, really strong at making sure we have our own school, that is, your own school is the heart of the community. And where I'm sympathetic to all of that, I still feel that we have to look at options. And we have two twin communities. This is heresy, what I'm about to say, but, and I'd never stand up in a school meeting and say it, but we have Plainfield and Cornish, and we're very similar in a lot of ways. We're different in a lot of ways, but we're very similar in a lot of ways. And just like in the old days, they had neighborhood schools. And it was heresy to think, oh, we're going to do away with our neighborhood schools and go all the way to the central school down on Townhouse Road. But they did, and it was natural. And you look back now and you say, why wasn't it done earlier? I think at some point it'll be natural and logical that the schools in these two communities combine. But there's a huge resistance to that among a lot of people. It won't be easy. It's just, how low can you go? That's the question. We're in the 80s or whatever, and we've had a kindergarten with, 2 people in it at times. I think there should be more of an open mind to looking at options.
You know, just in relation to that, when I did the interview with Steve Taylor, he grew up in Plainfield, but at that time, it didn't seem to matter where you went to school. He went to the Tracy, he started off at the Tracy School. Even though he lived in Plainfield, he went to the Tracy School, in Cornish. So your view really is that you don't see the population coming back in terms of the enrollment. And I wonder, the other thing in Cornish that this is something that has not changed, and in terms of the preservation of open space,
right,
in country.
Right.
Now, this is done through common use or 5-acre zoning.
Yeah.
Now, there are different views on this. To what extent has the willingness or the desire for open space inhibited the growth of population with young families?
I think it's inhibited it a lot. If there's a lot of open space, there's a lot of developed land in this community that could be developed, and you could have subdivisions, and you could have 15 or 20 houses in a certain area, but our zoning has not been designed to allow that kind of growth. So I think that you're absolutely right. I think that the zoning has inhibited an influx of people. There aren't that many options.
George?
Well, I would differ with her in this way. I don't think there's the demand. So even if we had 1-acre zoning over the whole town, there isn't a demand. The area is not growing. No other towns are growing. Lebanon, I suppose, is growing. Some Claremont certainly isn't growing. The Vermont communities are not growing. So if we went to half-acre zoning tomorrow, there's nobody looking to build those houses. Of course, there'd be some, but I don't think it would radically change what we have. But let me more directly address the issue of
The zoning, the 5 acre?
well, current use.
Current
Okay.
use.
Current use.
Struggling for the word. I see current use as being quite unfair. Now, we enjoy the benefits of current use on this property right now today. And there are those, and it's just not fair that we enjoy that advantage where somebody with 3 acres is paying 100% of their, not only are they paying 100% of their tax bill, they're paying more because our taxes are less. And so the interesting thing, and I've vowed to study this, and I haven't done it yet. I literally have a file folder to do this. I want to know what effect it does have on the people that are not in current use as a percent. Now, yeah,
I
you
would say that Steve Taylor agrees with you exactly.
yeah,
And what this amounts to is a transfer of the tax.
absolutely,
Tax burden.
It's a burden.
absolutely.
Transfer
And
the burden.
but, and this is my big but. The person who is not in current use, are their taxes more by 2%, 12%, 17%? I want to know that, and it should be easy to determine because if you recast the taxes in this town and had everybody pay 100%, how much less would the person that's not in current use pay? And I do want to know that because it would quantify the unfairness. Because if it's 2%, then I have to say that it's worth the system. Because keeping open space, I think, is very good.
Call from Emily.
That is one of our daughters, and
Well, apropos to
We have-
Call from Emily.
we have 3 daughters, and they call basically
Call
every day.
from Emily.
Every day, sometimes twice a day. That's Texas.
You want to
calling.
pause?
No,
No,
no.
we're fine.
But anyway,
But
so
I think it's a very excellent point. You know, and Steve Taylor raised the same
Yeah.
issues.
if it costs that person if it costs them 15%, that's just plain wrong. That person is paying more taxes every single year, so that I can pay less taxes.
Yes. You know, one other volunteer activity that of yours, George, that I'm familiar with, is that you are a master carpenter. And I learned that when I worked with you on the restoration of the Korea barn. And just recently, you designed a ramp project on Harrington Road, and with the Neighbor to Neighbor project. And for our Neighbor to Neighbor group, you know, when we cut and split firewood, I always look to you first to see if George is available. So you're always the key on that. You know, I think that I've covered the things that I would like to cover for Cornish history, but I would like to open it up to you too. If there are things that we didn't cover that you would like to add. You know, I know you don't want to go too much. It's not Cornish history, but I know you enjoy your winters now in Key West. You know.
Oh, yes.
So this is your open time. Anything you would like to add to the interview, please feel free.
Well, you tell them just briefly about how we spend our winter, what we do, where we go.
We happen to have been fortunate enough to buy a single-family home in Key West in 2008, 7.
Eight.
And but we are not Florida residents. So what we do is we've decided that January through March is very cold in Cornish, so we spend those 3 months in Key West, and then we rent the house out to a number of people. Over the rest of the year, many of the people come back the next year, so it works very well. And it's been good for us to get away from here because it's so cold. But we also travel as we go north and south. So we go to New Orleans, or we'll go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or we'll go out to South Bend, Indiana, or we'll go to Galena, Illinois. We're just, places on the way north and south, and visit historic sites on our travels, and that's been fun too.
I remember one time you went to Cuba.
Oh yes, we've been to Cuba Well,
I've been to
George has
Cuba
been
3 times.
3 times?
And Jill's been twice.
Twice.
First time I went was with my daughter Abigail. Jill was teaching and couldn't get the time off in about 2000 or so. And then we went again in 2002. And then we went again about 2 or 3 years ago. Love Cuba. Absolutely love Cuba.
Anything else in the community or in your lives that we didn't cover that you would like to add? This is
Well, let me comment. You fed me a line there when you said I'm a builder. I call myself a hobby builder because I've never built for money. And I started out, as I said, as a little kid building. Bought my first property when I was 21 and kind of rehabbed that. I bought and gutted a number of houses, gutted them to the outside wall and completely rebuilt them. I built the addition that we're sitting in here. I built my workshop. I built a storage building down on 120. And I built our bunkhouse, as we call it here. So I love building. So it's just adding on to that a little bit. Getting back to Cornish history, I would want to mention a person by the name of Michael Yatsevich, which again, a lot of people in town remember Michael. Michael's been gone, I don't know how many years now, but Michael Yatsevich was, in a way, the #1 citizen of this community in the 48 years that I've been here. He served how many years on the school board?
Oh, way more than I did,
Maybe 30. And how many years as selectman?
which were concurrent terms
Yeah,
too.
maybe 30.
Right.
I mean, he was the...
He was a town father.
He was the town father. A wonderful person. Personally, he spent many hours in this house because he and Joe were on the school board at the same time. So he would stop by to discuss school board matters, probably very wrong in today's world
Probably.
of sunshine laws and all. I don't remember them colluding here, but he just stopped by to talk a little bit. And Michael was also known, and I say this with love and affection, as kind of a waffler. He would tend to not take a real strong position many times. He'd kind of wait to see how it was moving, but he was a conciliator also, in that he would bring people together. So he was just, in my mind, a top person in this.
The other thing about Michael, you could ask him a question, what do you think? He would always answer your question with a question. You could almost never get an answer from
Right.
Michael.
Yes. You'd ask him what he thought, and he would come back and say, raise a question about it. He wouldn't ask. He was wonderful.
Very skilled at.
Chester Newbold said many of the
Really?
same things. And
Yeah.
If you had a complaint and you went to Mike Yatsevich, he would say, "Well, why don't you do something about it?"
Yeah, right.
You know, that was it,
Right.
you know.
He was.
Yes,
He
Yeah.
was a wonderful person.
yes, I knew him. I met him, yes.
Now,
Jill, anything else that you would like to add? Or,
I don't think so. You've talked about the meeting house with Caroline, so you don't.
Well, let me briefly touch on the meeting house. The meeting house, the Baptist church decided they didn't need 2 buildings, so they said they'd like to sell one to the town for $1. And a lot of townspeople at the town meeting said, we don't want another town building. We don't want another building to maintain. And a group of us said that, the sequence and all that I'm forgetting, but we would attempt in the future to keep the building, maintain the building without going after tax dollars. And to a great extent, we've done that. Caroline Storrs and myself were on that initial committee and have worked on it to this day. And that's been 40 years, 70 something to now. So anyway,
Susan.
and Susan Chandler is
well,
on it now.
you got an L-ship grant, and that was a significant accomplishment.
2 years ago, we got a $50,000 matching grant, so we had to get the other $50,000 ourselves through soft and hard grants. And yeah, we put $100,000 in it just a couple years
Well,
ago.
we're still involved in the building. We still have a collection.
Absolutely.
Down there for the
Yeah.
Historical Society. Well, I think, are we...
We're
Anything
fine.
else?
We're done.
I always, at the end of the interview, I always turn to Billy and say, well, Billy, that's a take.